Hi, everyone. Hello, friends. I'm here to make a video tonight because I want to give a talk on some concepts that I have spent the past 3 years really um, encountering and slowly synthesizing. And this past week, I've reached a point where I'm like, it's time. It's time for me to take everything that I have been learning and observing and put it out there in a sort of map of different concepts. And this is going to be for sure a very ADHD, conspiracy theory guy meme, not actual conspiracy theories, but like, the meme where all the yarn on the, that's going to be me mapping everything out. And because of that, I'm really going to give myself some grace to go slowly and to take my time because this feels very big for me. And it feels very edgy. It's funny because I'm not really going to be sharing a whole lot that is like personal to me, like to events in my life. I'm going to be sharing a lot of concepts about consciousness that apply to ways that we think about and treat mental health. And that feels edgy because magic and mental health have for so long been seen as being at odds with one another. And I have experienced so very much um, in my own life where I have leaned back upon very left-brained, very logical, rational, um, really feeling like it was unsafe for me to get to like woo-woo, right? And everyone by this point knows I'm a practicing magician. I've been practicing for 10 years. Or if you don't know, hi. If you don't know that, maybe you don't, welcome. But that's out now, right? That's public. I am the apprentice and lineage heir to chaos magician Grant Morrison, which I'm very proud of. And but even in my allowing myself entry into magic 10 years ago, the reason that I chose chaos magic as a discipline to study was precisely because it defines itself as being results based. You do something and you get a result. And I thought to myself, even the most hardened skeptic could not argue that me doing something that gives me a result is useful to me. So I wouldn't have to be like, defending whether something is real or not. I do this practice, it works. I don't care why it works. It works. And I did get into magic not really out of any desire for an aesthetic, as much as I very much have that aesthetic. Um, but not so much out of, oh, I want to study or practice magic. I have an interest in magic itself. Although maybe, sure, I did somewhat, but it was really actually out of utility, out of a need to change my life when very little else had worked. And that's really what sold me on it. That's why I continue to practice to this day, because it is incredibly effective. And as I have used magic to first create the pathway to all the understandings of trauma, conditioning, NLP, all of the things that led me down my own path of spiritual awakening and or repatterning, which led me to not only change all of my own inner wiring, but to create the repatterning project, the course that I teach, out of that practice that emerged out of this journey. As I continue on this path, which was begun with magic and led me into understandings of mental health and has also progressed as I've been teaching more and awakening myself more and working with others more. And in the past 3 years or so, the the scope in which I have been working has really, really, really expanded in ways that I have not spoken about yet. Um, Often because those stories aren't public domain, because I'm working either with friends or with clients or with, folks who may sort of be in that liminal space in between. And I certainly don't intend to share any of what was entrusted to me um, in those containers. But I do want to look at some of the patterns and some of the learnings that some of the things that have happened in those containers or come up in those containers um, have brought to my attention the concepts, the areas of study. And in so many ways, magic and occultism has brought information that has, to me, proved a more complete and effective understanding of consciousness in a way that maps it out for, among other things, the ability to better treat mental health issues. Yeah, I want to make I want to make a video today about some of that map. So I want to share some of those larger patterns and the areas of study and research, whether in mental health or occultism, or again in the liminal space between both. I want to share some of that. And it feels edgy because, again, so much of our contemporary mental health industry, even the fact that we have a phrase such as magical thinking, it's like it's an attempt to stop the conversation before it even starts. The minute you talk about magic, right? Never mind that it is a practice that is centuries, if not like millennia older than what we think of as contemporary mental health today, right? Contemporary psychiatry, psychology, etc. But that's why it feels vulnerable for me, even though I'm only really in many ways going to be talking about concepts. It feels very edgy for me. So again, because it's big and there's a lot of areas I'm going to cover, and it's a big old ADHD network of thoughts of a map that I'm going to try and put out, I'm going to, again, allow myself slowness and grace. And yeah, and hopefully I will be able to convey everything that I wish to convey. And hopefully some of you out there will find this useful or interesting or entertaining, and maybe you'll go, oh my God, this puts so much together for me. And I am also aware that there are probably people I'm going to lose after this video. That is the nature of growth. And like I teach this, right? when we grow, when we expand, if we, if kind of where we're at in our own self-development, or like, or even not even development, right? Not even hierarchical. If we're wherever we're at in our own sort of energy attracts what is a match to us, then whenever we change, we're going to gain people and we're going to lose people. It is what it is. All I can say is that, like, I am not doing this for attention. All right. One last thing before we get started is also, as much as I love to categorize things and put things in these like neat little boxes, and believe me, I do, it is part of the expression of my very left-brained autism. When I was a little kid, I came home from school and told my mom that it had been the best day of my life, because we had learned matrix logic, those puzzles where this person was at this place at this hour or whatever, and you do the little dots and the X's and the boxes, right? Those, that was for me, that was just like brain euphoria and still is. And in some ways, like this is me attempting to take these thin slices of information that I've learned about consciousness, about magic, about spirit, about mental health, and put it into its own complete matrix logic puzzle, very large one, right? Um, but something that I have learned along the way of doing this is that it's really wise to stay away from any kind of binary thinking. Because while I love, little boxes and little categories, and this is this and that is that, and those inquiries and those questions have always served me, that desire to define things, to understand them as completely as possible has absolutely served me. But the more that I lean into the service of those questions, the more the answer comes back, well, Arden, there we live in a universe of infinite possibility. And so anytime you look at any one factor, any one element, you could be looking at something and say, well, this has a little bit of this element from the map and a little bit of that, and it all adds up to this very unique recipe, right? Tyler Durden, we actually are these unique snowflakes, each and every one of us, because we are all made up of different experiences and memories and responses and reactions and different epigenetics, different everything. So an allowance that things are more often on gradient spectrums than they are in neat categories, but that understanding the polarities on those spectrums is also helpful so we can sort of orient ourselves, right? And allowing also that there are like near infinite permutations of things is going to be really helpful in understanding some of this. And as much as I love answers, the questions, living in the questions. So much of my work with a lot of my advanced students lately has boiled down to, you are asking the right questions. I don't know, but this is the direction to go in. And so a lot of this is going to be about us asking the right questions. And that is actually more maybe truthful and satisfying an answer than I would have initially thought it to be when I needed everything to be so concrete, because there is actually more truth there than there is in some of the outdated and obsolete paradigms that try to box things in. And when things don't fit and there's friction, there's no room in those models for what is the actual truth until we change the model, right? So this is my attempt at changing a model. We're going to talk about consciousness. We're going to talk about spirit diplomacy, spirit communication. We're going to talk about spirit that is the human spirit. We're going to be talking about spirits that are not linked to bodies. We're going to talk about multiple spirits being in one body. We're going to talk about the ways that spirits can come and go, and ways that consciousness within a body can grow and be shaped, whether by our passive experiences, whether by ourselves and our intentions, or whether by others and their intentions. This is where I am living lately. All right. So we're going to start off by talking about the consciousness that exists in the individual human body. For most of us, what we tend to think of as normative, right? There is, I have a body and I have a consciousness within it, right? And these two things are in this symbiotic relationship. So as I'm speaking to you, it's my consciousness that is choosing the words. It is my consciousness, my will, that chooses to pick up this marker and put it back down, right? But it's my body that's doing the picking up. It's my mouth that's doing the speaking. And For most of what we tend to think of, and I'm going to challenge this notion as well, but let's just go with like the assumed standard, right? Is that there is one consciousness, one body, right? I am Arden. I have a consciousness that is Arden in the body that is Arden. And these two things operate as this one unit, which we might call an ego, right? And the ego is not bad. The ego is like, I have to know that I'm me and you're you. Otherwise, we're going to be a mess, right? So the ego is like the car that I use to navigate through my reality. I drive around in the world in the vehicle of my ego, thinking that I am limited to only my ego or my concept of my ego is limiting. When I realize that I can shape my ego to my liking because I am connected to the infinite all that is, that is empowerment, and some would argue enlightenment, or at least a step on the path to enlightenment, right? But for all intents and purposes, consciousness, body, and I'm going to refer to this with this normative idea of one consciousness in one body, with a term that I've learned from the plural community, which I'll also be talking about in a moment, called singlet consciousness, right? I am a singlet. There is just one of me in my body, and that's who I am, right? So I'm going to start drawing just some very basic kind of stick figure, right? There they are. And there is, I'm going to draw a little thought bubble. There is the consciousness that is within the body, right? Singlet consciousness. And for most of our mental health issues, as I have learned to treat them through my work anyway, most of our anxiety, depression, bad feelings, etc., actually come from our lived experience and or are passed on epigenetically through our learned ideas about the world. This is what I refer to as our patterning or programming. And so when we talk about repatterning, what I mean is that we are consciously and intentionally shaping ourselves and our thoughts, our perhaps even our very neural architecture to make ourselves into our favorite version of ourselves that can thrive in the life that we dreamed about having when we were a little kid, right? So we're born into this world, but we have traumas that affect us. And if you've taken the repatterning project, or even if you've taken like the intro to repatterning that I have on my site that is available, um, this is like stuff that we go over right away. This is like the crux of the repatterning project is we are born into this body, we come out into the world, and we immediately start interacting with the world around us slowly as we grow and develop. And we learn things through these experiential interactions with the world. I touch the hot stove, I learn that it's hot, right? And this is how our patterns form. They form as these internal algorithms, as I like to call them, right? If X, then Y. So I learn when I'm in seventh grade and I go up to my crush and I ask him to dance with me, you know, and he rejects me and he says no, which, believe it or not, that actually did happen. That happened more often than not, which is part of like part of why I required so much repatterning. You know, I was a young undiagnosed autistic femme, and I was super intense, and I, you know, masked and didn't know how to unmask, and anyway, all of that led to a lot of experiences of rejection, right? So one of my patterns, one of my internal algorithms for a long time was if X, then Y. If I open my heart and share my feelings with someone that I have feelings for, I'm probably going to get rejected. And honestly, I had a lot of evidence in my external reality of this being true, right? And so that causes anxiety, that causes attachment issues in relationship, right? I'm always anticipating rejection. And that then creates these patterns, right? So to be able to, you know, to repattern is essentially to recognize these and replace these, right? Replace these with something else. Um, for me, what that looked like was, you know, really working on internalizing a belief of um, well, several, but for the sake of brevity, because I know this video is going to be long already, it's like, I'm not interested in anyone who's not interested in me because I've been rejected before and I'm like, I'm bored with it. It's like I no longer feel this need to, you know, chase after someone to prove my worth because I know my worth actually. And actually, if someone is not stepping up, I mean, that's fine. Maybe they're like, they just, aren't, I'm not their thing or whatever, and that's fine, right? But maybe also I can sort of take on a belief of like, actually, they're a little boring, that they can't see actually what's great about me. And the thing that is exciting that I'm going to get like really, really, passionate over is the idea of finding someone who can see me and meet me in that capacity. I'm no longer going to, like, then if they reject me, I might feel disappointment, right? I'll be like, oh man, that sucks that you couldn't meet me where I hoped that you would, right? But it doesn't become this like heartbreak, low self-esteem thing that it absolutely did when I was younger because I just couldn't understand it, right? Um, yeah, the clarity of an autism diagnosis or self-diagnosis rather, because obviously the mental health industry did not catch on to what was going on. It was me, and then I went and sought out my official diagnosis. Anyway, um, so these are how we take these patterns on. And if they're not made conscious, then we will continue, right? As Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, right? So in the same way, we sort of bring up, oh, of course, I understand why I learned that opening my heart to someone was scary. Of course I would have. Look at all these experiences I had. And however, my future does not have to look like that. And what beliefs would serve me, because if I take on the beliefs that generate essentially um, the outcomes that I want, right? That is to repattern, to change our internal programming in a way that generates external results, right? And yeah, like it works. It works. And where it doesn't, right? Then that, as Robert Anton Wilson said, new limits that are discovered experientially and experimentally are then like new beliefs to reprogram. Like so you can keep doing it basically. Which means you can be an active agent in your life, right? Even when you do hit a wall, you're like, okay, well, what do I have to do to get over this wall? And I'll say this, like, especially as someone with ADHD who is very dopamine deficient, this way of sort of like gamifying my life has honestly like cured my entire depression, given me the will to live, right? That I really very much, because I didn't always. Having the will to live was not always easy in my life. And this way of being repatterning has just yeah, it's changed everything for me. And so, because I didn't understand before, like how trauma happens and it conditions us. And even if we think we're over something or we think it didn't affect us, like it's still probably operating unconsciously. And I couldn't see those things because there was so much logic behind my beliefs. I was like, but all these things did happen to me. Right? Anyway, that is the essence of repatterning. The essence of repatterning is essentially the understanding that we can look at our neurodevelopment. We can look at the thoughts and beliefs and feelings and responses and reactions that emerge as a result of our conditioning or what we take on epigenetically through our lineage and what we experience societally, right? All of these things are factors. Everything is a factor. Again, no binaries, right? Everything can condition us. And we start to choose the programming intentionally, consciously, that will then generate those external results that we want. And if you're me or if you're a magician, then you also use magic to fill in those gaps too, right? I'm going to do repatterning to make sure that I am a match to what I want. And I'm not going to sabotage it, that I'm ready for it. And then if there is like, hey, it's late capitalism and like doing anything, getting anything, getting anywhere in this world is like, is difficult. Then on top of that, I'm going to add magic to that in order to open my roads to success or create more luck or bring opportunities my way. That, in a nutshell, is basically my recipe for creating a happy and successful life that I get to be in control of. Um, Does it always work? Not always on the time schedule that I want it to, right? But even when it doesn't work, again, then it's like I'm still invested. I'm still like, what didn't work about that? What do I need to troubleshoot, right? Which is so, so very different from that feeling of being out of control in your life, which I did feel when I was depressed, right? All of this keeps happening to me and I can't stop it. These patterns keep, I don't understand why. I'm a nice person. Why is this? Why is everything so bad? Oh, now I understand because, I don't know how to draw boundaries. I keep thinking I need to prove myself worthy of love, all that, right? So, as we have a consciousness that is born into this body, it takes on these learnings. And we can even think of these as like neural pathways that are formed in our minds. There's a great sort of allegory for our neurodevelopment that is in the book called Your Brain on Art. And it talks about how we can imagine our neural pathways as like all of these stretches of highway. And the ones that get driven a lot have like big lights on them and signs and like a 4-lane highway, like a big obvious path. As opposed to like the ones that we don't use as often, being like dark or dimly lit. I like to think of it also as pathways in a forest. We walk down a path in a forest, like you go and you do a sequence of actions, you have a habit or something like that. Like that's how a habit often will form, right? Or ease, at least creating ease and familiarity there, right? As someone with ADHD, habits are a little iffy for me too. So, right. But you create familiarity, you create that path of least resistance through things like repetition, right? Also, big shocking events like a trauma can create that lightning path in the forest, right? Where it's like, oh, boom, now there's a huge path that wasn't there before because a big event that was a shock to the system happened, right? That can also, form our wiring. Um, Osmosis, joining a new social circle means like the ways that people behave around us, we're going to start to pick those up because we are naturally wired biologically to avoid ostracism because in caveman days, ostracism meant certain death. So we're going to, like, all of these things lead to how our neural architecture starts to form. And so these patterns, whether they're thoughts or habits, right? Um, these end up like sort of comprising our personality. What we think of as that, right? We are basically this beautiful kaleidoscope of thoughts and beliefs and responses and understandings and and reactions and associations that is living in this neural architecture of our brain and which is like a consciousness that is in our body and there we are, right? And like 90% if not more of mental health issues, I believe, are solved by essentially repatterning the thoughts and beliefs that we either inherited or, whether epigenetically or even just like through the culture of our families, right? Or took on through our conditioning or learned through events of trauma. I believe that probably somewhere around 90% of what we think of as mental health issues today can be resolved by repatterning, with the caveat that it is important to establish safety first, right? A body that is like reacting to traumatic circumstances is reacting in a healthy manner. It is not because like if you're genuinely not safe, then like your body is by reacting in a way that is it like it's traumatized, like that's a healthy reaction to being in danger, right? That's actually your body protecting you. So I say that because living in late capitalism and especially lately with like so many groups of different people that are under attack by our administration, like all of that, like it is very important to understand that like you can repattern until the cows come home. If you're still not safe in the world, you're still not safe in the world. That might not be a mental health issue, but that's going to cause mental health issues, right? Being unsafe in the world, like genuinely experiencing trauma genuinely causes trauma, which imprints us. And then like that anxiety is merited, right? That is actually like that's not a mental health issue. That's like, so I say that as a big caveat. But assuming that we can get ourselves to a place of relative safety, and again, I don't say that as any small thing in the climate that we currently live in, but if we can get ourselves to that ground of safety, to something that feels relatively safe, right? My belief is that almost 90% of mental health issues then can be solved by essentially, setting up the patterns that generate the life that we want. And then we're happy, right? And we might still, encounter grief and loss, of course, things like that, right? But we feel hopefully in control of our, not of what we're not in control, but in control of our path, right? So it is also possible, if it is possible for trauma to condition us, right, and to form sort of our personalities, to form these beliefs and patterns and imprints that we think of as our personalities, we can be the version of me, for example, that was in my trauma imprints is very different from the version of me that repatterned. And I did it in a relatively quick amount of time too. And I had people also say to me, like, damn, Arden, I've never seen anyone's vibe change that quickly. You know, once I figured it out, I basically I recreated my personality and I'm still growing, right? I'm still growing and learning. There's still things that I'm like, I could be better, I could, you know, be more authentic or whatever that looks like, right? It's a lifelong journey, but at the very least, like we can reach a sort of sustainable baseline that allows us to function, right? So that process for me took about 2 years. And now that's what I teach in the repatterning project. I teach people how to do that for themselves. And um, so if it stands to reason that if we understand our neurodevelopment, we understand how we learn things, we understand how traumas imprint and condition us. And we also understand how healing, right, having corrective experiences can also condition us, right, or decondition us, whatever we choose to think of, right? It can help us to become our more authentic self. We can change our personality based on our ability to repattern. And we can also become conditioned in ways that are not in our control, that we don't have agency over by the traumas that happen to us or by the circumstances that we are powerless to change, especially when we're very young, right? And um, there's also ways that other people with generally usually bad intentions can also condition us to their liking, right? This is where a lot of abuse and mind control and things like that come in. And I am a survivor of hypnotic programming. I think my case is really pretty interesting because it happened when I was in my early 20s, early to mid 20s. And and it was not like most abuse situations like that where hypnosis is involved. That person, that abuser probably learned hypnosis to try and make sure that the person didn't remember the abuse. But that was not the case in mine. It was in the context of a BDSM relationship and it was consensual. So there was no other sort of separate part that needed to be created, no memory loss or whatever. It was just that I was conditioned on purpose to be more submissive, to not have needs, to yeah, you know, which all because of all of my past like rejection trauma and everything had already um you know, like my trauma already made me ripe for that conditioning, right? But I went in like really genuinely wanting to like be, because it was also part of my fantasy too, like wanting to be a really good submissive. And so subjecting myself to this consensually, which even though it was consensual, does not mean that it did not have an effect on me, which was very, very weird to realize many years later after the breakup. Like, oh, I still have this programming on me. I started working with my facilitator after I moved out to Los Angeles, Catherine Girardi, who I've been working with since 2016. She's amazing. And in one of our early sessions, you know, which no other, like no therapist, no mental health industrial complex professional had ever been able to pick up on. A few sessions in, she was like, oh my goodness, you've got an entire like matrix of programming on you. She's like, I'm impressed. The work, the craftsmanship itself is beautiful, but it's got to go. It doesn't belong to you. So, and that was like right around the beginning of my journey of repatterning, right? And the difference in who I was then with that programming and who I am now is night and day. So I speak about singlet consciousness, right? I am a singlet consciousness, and I attribute that greatly, I believe anyway, to the fact that I have a pretty extraordinary memory. It is part of the expression of my very left-brained autism. It is a gift as well as sometimes a curse, but I have a really good memory of things that happen. So I can piece together my timeline very easily. So I feel this through line throughout my life that I'm like, I've always been there. But the difference between who I was with that hypnotic programming, which, again, was sort of the foundation for that was laid by the trauma, but which made me a good candidate for it, right? And then that programming put over top of it. So repatterning, removing that conditioning, and really getting back to the root and the essence of what is me and who do I want to be in the world. Those two iterations of my spirit, my consciousness, are so different. They almost may as well be different people. So we have a consciousness that is anchored to the body and it can be conditioned on purpose by ourselves. It can be conditioned passively. It always is. We cannot avoid being passively conditioned by our experiences, but we can condition ourselves intentionally if we learn skills like repatterning, or whatever trauma healing modality you practice. There's many paths, and or other people can condition us to their liking, right? Abusers usually, and there are people who cultivate this. There are people who study how to do this to people, how to create certain effects. um, it's dark, but it happens. And especially as like we're at this time in consciousness where, in the collective, we're all like, where's the Epstein client list and everything? It's almost like we are so kind of fed up or desensitized from the ongoing barrage of daily horrors that we're maybe finally ready as a society to actually start embracing the fact that this does go on, that it is common, right? And it doesn't even have to be like some secret cabal of people. Maybe it is, certain. I think there's many ritual cults that have sort of arisen, and but it's also people in your small town communities too. Where do they learn that? I don't know. It's a good question. I don't think they're going to let me fly to Epstein's Island and interview them. Wow, I would love, out of like just out of neural curiosity, like what do you, so how do you, but I don't think they're going to tell me. So this kind of conditioning can basically form our personality. It can happen passively. It can happen intentionally because we do it intentionally for our healing. It can happen because others are abusing us intentionally and conditioning us to their liking. It can happen on any gradient of the spectrum between those two, because you can have a person who is not like doing mind control on you on purpose, but they may have learned through their own trauma patterning that being manipulative is something that gets them the result that they want. They may be in some ways doing it unconsciously, right? Or they may actually be studying it and saying, you know, they may be, committing the kind of atrocities that happen on Epstein's Island. So there are all those possibilities for what a fragment of consciousness, right, or a piece of consciousness that is in a human body can take on to change or shape its quality. So there we have it. That is singlet consciousness. Um, one of the features of autism, there is, and I'm autistic, right? I think I mentioned that already. Yeah, I did. One of the features of autism is something called cortical overgrowth. It means that all those highways, all those pathways in the brain, we have more of them than your average person. Our brains actually process, I want to say something like 72% more information at rest than a neurotypical brain. So we have it's called cortical overgrowth, right? Our cortex, they're overgrown, like the briars around Sleeping Beauty's castle, right? It's why, we may feel like we have like 60 tabs open in our heads at any given time. It's why I believe anyway, it's part of why we can easily get overstimulated. We can be sensitive to certain sensory things, all of that, all of that stuff. It's also why I think we have a gift for information synthesis. It also can mean that we learn and pick up on these patterns at a faster rate than neurotypicals because we have more of the neural pathways to make those connections. So we can learn things sometimes faster. However, those things can also root in more strongly. So it can also mean that unlearning is more difficult, which is often why there is a correlation between autism and addiction. It is a lot more difficult, in my understanding, for an autistic person to break a cycle of addiction because due to the cortical overgrowth, those responses are rooted in a lot more strongly. And there's, I think, other reasons for that too, also, like because if you're dealing with sensory overload all the time and you're overstimulated, you're probably going to want to go and like, go to a soothing substance to quiet the world down, right? So all of those things are factors. But one thing also that I think is an interesting thing to think about, and this is again something that again, these are connections that I'm making that I haven't really, even though I've had lots of really interesting talks with Grant, my mentor, and with other folks who are in the fields and who are doing this kind of thing. I'm putting this out there as a map of what my thoughts are. It's it's who knows, maybe people will build on it, maybe someone will correct it, but this is what I'm seeing, what I'm noticing. So I'm gonna just put these ideas out there because this is what is making sense to me. If due to cortical overgrowth, it is possible to learn patterns more quickly and easily, and they root in more strongly. There is also a correlation between autism and dissociative identity disorder. Dissociative identity disorder, we are going to start talking about plurality. We are going to start talking about plurality as another permutation of consciousness. And so dissociative identity disorder is what is the clinical name for when there are multiple consciousnesses in a body. That is plurality. I should say dissociative identity disorder, the disorder part generally, I mean, it's kind of like right now as the mental health industrial complex stands, it's kind of like because they are so attached to the neuronormative version of consciousness, like they will call anything that doesn't look like that a disorder, but really a disorder, we want to think of a disorder only when those parts are like having trouble functioning as a team that is causing disruption, or difficulty with the quality of living or the peace or the mental health of all of those consciousnesses that are linked to that body, right? So plurality is the sort of non-stigmatizing term that basically means there are multiple consciousnesses in this body, but it's not a disorder. There's nothing, it's just another possibility in this world of infinite possibility, with, you know, with very few binaries and lots of different ways to exist. There is, as I was saying, a higher correlation of DID in folks with autism. My theory around this is that parts can be essentially clusters of learned patterns and memories and experiences. So if I'm a singlet consciousness, but I'm a spicy singlet because I'm a survivor of hypnotic programming and I had to repattern myself, right? But if I am a singlet consciousness, I can like learn all these things and have a sort of idea of what is my personality, what is Arden, what is my ego that I drive around in the world with, right? But what if there are events in your life that are so difficult to hold that it causes a fragmentation in your learning? And there are some neural pathways that develop this way, and some that develop this way, and some that say hold the trauma and have all of the imprinted patterns and beliefs and mindsets and reactions and responses that come with that trauma, and another part of your consciousness that doesn't because it needs to actually function in the world in everyday life, right? This is where we start to get into at least traumagenic plurality, right? A trauma happens and it is so shocking to the system that in order for the system to survive, the consciousness in the body to function in the way that it needs to in the world, a fragmentation happens so that one part can hold the trauma and one part can continue to function. That's a very, that's at the very least, that's one way of looking at traumagenic DID or a form of plurality, right? So when we start to think about the ability of consciousness to separate into different parts, right? And some of you may have heard of a modality called IFS, Internal Family Systems, which was developed by a guy named Dick Schwartz. And he's got a book called No Bad Parts. And I find it to be a really great like primer for the idea of parts work. It's, um, it's something that a lot of plural folks have kind of criticized because they're like, hey, we maybe have it different than the IFL. Like then you're not really describing us. This may not be accessible to us. And are you or are you not sort of almost co-opting some of our language, right? Um, and also there are folks who are like, actually, this has created more acceptance about the idea of plurality because if we can understand that everyone has parts, um, there can be more acceptance. So I have sort of, and I'm going to use a teaching aid right now. I'm going to use Mr. Freud. This is my pink Freud shirt because I can't resist a joke that encapsulates my two main aspects of my own personal consciousness, music and psychology. So, uh, so I want like here we have this, the joke is it's the Dark Side of the Moon logo, right? The Pink Floyd album. Only it's Pink Floyd and it's the dark side of your mom, right? So, but I like to use this sort of prism analogy. So we'll imagine it's a regular prism there instead of Mr. Freud's head. But I like to use this as an allegory for understanding parts work. I imagine this is consciousness entering the body, right? So it's going right into Mr. Freud's brain right there. This white light, this pure white light of consciousness. And then on the other side, it expresses itself, right, through our personality in the world as this sort of you know this expression of multifacetedness. There is actually a theory that when we are born, we are all parts and we only integrate into a singlet consciousness as we develop the ability to integrate our understanding of the world as we're, babies who are growing up. Um, I think that's interesting to think about, but I think it's like we all have parts, right? So even a singlet consciousness basically, can benefit from something like internal family systems, which basically theorizes that we all have different parts within ourselves and that some of our mental illness or like our anxiety or depression or whatever can be caused by like these parts sort of being at war with themselves, right? So like you have someone suffering from addiction, for example. There might be the part that actually really genuinely wants to be sober. And then there's also the part over here that's like, but no, I really want to have a drink or whatever that looks like, right? And that's like, that can be extremely compatible with ideas of singlet normative consciousness. We can say, part of me really wants to work today because I have a lot of work to get done, but part of me wants to go to the beach, right? And these parts like are like it can be that simple. Plurality as I sort of think about it or understand it, is, and as Dick Schwartz himself says in No Bad Parts, he's like, people with DID, essentially, like their parts are just in greater relief to one another, right? So I like to think of parts as being on a spectrum. If you have like singlet consciousness that can like, but those parts are like close to one another, there's no dissociative amnesia, they all have the same memory, right? But the more these parts are separated from one another, the more that these parts grow apart, because again, this one has the trauma, but this one's got a function or whatever, they grow in greater relief to one another. So out here on this end, the colors are a little farther spaced apart than they are right there, right? That's the way that I like to think of traumagenic DID as developing. And I think that the reason that it is more common in autistic folks is, again, autistic folks have more, literally more neural pathways in our minds. And so those patterns that, in a singlet consciousness would, part of me wants to do this, part of me wants to do that, or whatever, those patterns can go through the cycle of learning, and because our patterns will root and snowball, and you'll know this if you've taken the repatterning project, this is week 2, right? Our patterns will root in more strongly because the more we allow them to filter our reality through our consciousness, and we select what is familiar to us through our confirmation bias, the more strongly that belief will root in, and then the more strongly we hold that belief, the more we will see evidence of it in the world. And so it snowballs, right? So if a belief can root into our neural pathways by that path of least resistance being tread more and more often, and just that path in the forest being made more and more every time we tread it. And if every time we do that, it essentially provides us with more evidence that we're right through our confirmation bias, which like selects the part of our reality that we notice or resonate or with or are most familiar with, then our patterns are going to accelerate and root over time. So my thought is that with a lot of traumagenic DID anyway, that is sort of the result of pattern acceleration that essentially becomes so whole and full that it is basically what one would think of as its own personality, its own part, right? And because we don't do binaries, there can also be, in folks who are plural, they can talk about having fragments of consciousness, like a part that is really like less of a fully developed part, but more of like an interject, right? Or someone described it as like the butter robot in Rick and Morty. A plural person described this as like there's a robot in Rick and Morty, and it's the only purpose it's created for is like just to like pass the butter or whatever. And that's the only thing that it does. You can have a part, right? That is essentially like, this is just the one thing that I do. And anything in between, right? The more we can look at these as gradients and spectrums, the more understanding we're going to have about it. So my feeling is that the cortical overgrowth is what causes the acceleration in those learning of those patterns. And when you have clusters of patterns together, like those form parts or entire personalities, right? The more growth, the more fullness that is given to them, and they can grow in different directions. I find all of that really really, really cool and interesting. And yet I think it is one of many ways that plurality can arise. And again, you may also like you might have that sort of organic growth outward. I have seen that. I have seen examples of that where I can look back through a person's um, you know, like entries in their blog, and I can read, like I can see the different thoughts and patterns accelerating opposite, like and where like they're sort of integrated or whatever, like there's a struggle, then you can see them and like separate almost. I hope I am communicating that in a way that I can be understood, but doing this work for a while has simply given the ability to sort of see these things. Probably an easier example is just like, I don't know, you notice your friend like, maybe getting into like having us like hanging around a certain crowd or whatever, and like their beliefs start to, and then they accelerate, right? And you see them change in front of you. That's something that's probably like more visible, right? But it's the same essential like conditioning that is happening in these. So that is one way that plurality can express itself. So you have, let's go back here, right? Here's our singlet consciousness. And now let's say Pardon my stick figures once again. Um, and let's say like this consciousness branches off, right, into what is maybe a few different parts. Or perhaps there is an event or a trauma that is so shocking to the system that all of a sudden it creates a new part like then and there, right? So there you have it. That is one example of plurality. I'm going to get to some more. But in order to do that, we're going to have to talk about the kinds of consciousness that are not rooted to a body, what we may think of as spirits. So first, let's talk about what it looks like when a consciousness is not anchored to a body. And the first way we can think of that is we can think of like literally just a person dying, right? And we can think of ghosts in this sense. Many folks may have experience where they have been visited by a loved one who is really close to them. My mom has had this experience. I know other folks who have. Someone passes and they see them as an apparition, right? Or they simply feel like a message or they have something strange happen to them. My mom has had something happen where someone she's close to in her life, it's happened 4 times now, has passed away, and an email from them pops up to the top of her inbox as though it is unread. And it's an email that's from the past, but it pops up and all of a sudden it's unread at the top of her inbox. Right? Strange. Um, so we can think of a consciousness that is not rooted to a body. We can also think of this in terms of something like astral projection. If you practice astral projection, you are essentially taking your consciousness and you are briefly, hopefully it is still tethered to you, right? But you are briefly having it go out of your body and travel to somewhere else. And there are things, there are techniques such as remote viewing, et cetera, where, and literally like the government trains people in the military to like to be remote viewers. The CIA can, I think the salary is about like something like $35,000 a year. Like it's not very much, but it's probably, I don't know, if I had to be in the military anyway, I'd rather do that. Luckily I don't. Anyway, but like this is a thing, right? Remote viewing, astral projection, sending your spirit out of your body. Some people have had out of body experiences. Maybe you've been very near death and you have experienced that your consciousness has left your body and you're looking down at yourself. Sometimes people can report experiencing this even from something like a really intense panic attack, right? Oh my God, I'm floating outside of my body, or things don't feel real, or whatever that looks or feels like. Occultists often train in order to have their consciousness go out of their body, again, like astral projection, right? Like Luke Skywalker at the end of, wasn't The Last Jedi, what was it? The Star Wars movie everyone is mad about, right? Luke Skywalker astral projects in order to deflect the or to distract, right? To attract the attack upon himself, but he's not in a body, so he's like, you didn't harm me, right? So that's and that's actually really advanced, because not only did he remove his consciousness from his body, but he manifested his appearance there, right? In order for Kylo Ren to shoot at him, which is a very advanced, like that's something you would expect of a Jedi at the end of his life, throughout a life of mastery. I probably am not going to be able to do that anytime soon, but I don't know. Maybe you will if you practice a lot. It is possible to do, right? Um, so we have to accept basically that a spirit can be attached to a body or not attached to a body. And Jason Miller, who is an occultist and a teacher of magic, has a book called Consorting with Spirits. And this is kind of his definition of a spirit. It is an organized consciousness, right? I have a consciousness. Again, I have a spirit that is in my body, right? If I were to astral project or have an out of body experience, my spirit would leave my body. A spirit without a body, right? A disembodied consciousness that is essentially a spirit, and that could be a ghost. It could be, you know, the spirit of your ancestor. It could be a god. It could be an egregore. There are so many, again, infinite possibilities, infinite permutations, no boxes, no binaries. There are many, many different things that that a spirit can be. A spirit can be a demonic entity that is like free floating out there in the ether, but then comes into the body of a person and possesses it, right? And makes it perhaps do things that that person would not otherwise want to do, right? This is real. This is something that happens. It is also often mistaken for various forms of mental illness that the mental health industrial complex is more uh, um, comfortable with, right? We'll talk a little bit about that as well. I've seen at least a few cases of what was entity possession be interpreted as something like schizophrenia. DID is also routinely misdiagnosed as schizophrenia when DID is actually more common among the population than schizophrenia. DID is about 1 to 3% of the population is plural. And schizophrenia, I believe, is like 0.5 to 0.7%, maybe. I learned that from Katie Keach, who's a really incredible lived experience DID clinician. Several of these ideas come from her, so I'll credit her as they come up. We can also call spirits into ourselves on purpose. An occultist might do something like an invocation, right? And hopefully they are invoking a spirit that is friendly to them, you know, that they have a familiar relationship with. But maybe they invoke someone, a spirit, and they give really good advice. Like they say the thing that is needed. The spirit is speaking through them in that moment. Or maybe they're doing a ritual and they're like, I mean, so many rites and rituals that go way back in a lot of ancient texts are precisely this. I am invoking a god so I can speak and command with the power of a god and change my reality. And I'm saying these words, and as I say these words, I am invoking the spirit, and therefore I'm commanding and practicing magic because I am more powerful with a god in my body than I am without one, right? So those are also occult practices. Again, that's a spirit coming into a body, if only temporarily. There have also been folks who have like channeled entities, right? So if you look at like Abraham Hicks, that is an entity channeling through a body, right? And really just coming into the consciousness. I don't think anyway that Abraham like takes over the motor movements of Esther Hicks, but I don't know. But like that's another example, right? An entity channeling, channeling a person channeling an entity in order to deliver a message. Bashar, right? Same thing. I've known folks who have done that, and the way that they describe it is sort of like they're still their consciousness is still present, but they're like in the back seat. They're kind of letting the entity drive, so to speak. And the entity also needs to be able to like that person has to have hopefully a foundational like knowledge and lexicon or vocabulary for that entity to speak through, because if they don't, they're not going to have like almost think of it like magnetic poetry, right? Like they need like the building blocks of the message to deliver. So oftentimes like that entity will sort of need the lexicon of the person in order to transmit that message, right? So lots of interesting things about how that can happen. There are also theories that you know, look at something like an egregore, right? An egregore is typically thought of as a god or a spirit or a concept that begins perhaps as a collective belief, but then exists because of the power of that belief to create it, right? And if we're and we can think of that in a very materialistic way, like, oh, you know, even if God isn't real, God created religion, and religion has had all these like material effects in the world. So therefore, God is real as a concept. But I don't even mean that. What I mean is that the power of belief charges and that the stuff that consciousness is made of, which we can see like there's so many different permutations, right? Essentially forms this being almost like out of like the clay of the ether. And uh and it becomes something that is real. If any of you have taken my class on servitors, servitors is like you create an artificial spirit out of the ether of the consciousness of the universe, right? And that's also kind of like a butter robot, right? You create a spirit to sort of do a task that you set it to do kind of over and over again, rather than casting a spell once, right? You have a sigil that this is like a piece of code that executes an action, but a servitor you build to sort of execute that piece of code over and over again, much like the butter robot, right? So, what is the difference then between like the servitor and like the part that gets created within the body that's just the butter robot, right? These are the questions to be asking. These are what I mean when I say these are the questions where the truth resides somewhere, right? That are so much more interesting than any of the answers I ever would have thought that I knew. All right, so let's draw some of those, right? So we have now we have a ghost hanging out. Um, And perhaps even we can say that this ghost has recently come out of the body of this person. But now, you know, um, this person has passed. And so their consciousness leaves their body and is now in the ether, right? And then we kind of have all of these other possibilities of these other spirits floating around. Maybe up here is a ghost who has been dead for so long that it no longer resembles, you know, the shape of the person that it once inhabited, and it's just sort of a shade, you know, a collection of thoughts and feelings and maybe memories and traumas or whatnot. You might also have over here, you know, gods or deities who have arisen from religion. Were they created by the religion, by the belief in them that created them as an egregore, or did they exist before the religion existed? That's a great question. I don't know. Again, these are where the questions reside, right? But let's just say, like, consciousness is everywhere, and it is possible for consciousness to exist outside of us. It is possible for consciousness to exist within, consciousness does exist within all of us. It is possible for there to be free floating consciousness out there, whether they are spirits or whether they were ever once in a body, like an ancestor or a saint. A saint was once in a body, or whether they have never been in a body, like a god, like Hermes, right? To my understanding, right? Hermes has never actually been in a body unless he comes in and possesses a human to, you know, if a human invokes him, right? But someone who has never lived a life attached to a body. Most gods and deities are like that, right? You also have ascended masters, someone like Jesus, who did walk around in a body, but then he died, and now he has become, you know, especially because of all the belief in him. I'd say actually there's like so many different permutations of Jesus. You have New Age Jesus, you have right-wing evangelical Christian Jesus, who like looks nothing like the actual Jesus and all this stuff, right? All these different, you know, permutations of consciousness and spirit that are powered by belief, but not necessarily engineered by them, but possibly, and that there are just all these different ways for consciousness to exist, right? So let's go back to plurality. um, Something that's really also funny about me using this shirt as a teaching aid too is that I mentioned before that I have in my years of study now sort of acquired the gift of being able to see the evolution of people's neurodevelopment almost psychically, to see where those patterns started and rooted in, what they transformed into, which ones took dominance, where the parts and patterns formed, et cetera, where the fragmentation happened, if any, right? And the start of that actually was that Grant, my teacher, assigned me back in February 2022 to um, explore shadow work. And, you know, I mean, I'd already repatterned, so I felt like I'd done a lot of like shadow work. Or, I mean, I was pretty like, well, I was pretty self-aware at that time anyway. But what happened, which was really extraordinary, Grant was like, you should meditate on the idea of the dark side of the moon, which is a representation of our shadow side, right? The moon is so in love with the sea that it does not turn on an axis, right? Or that's like the mythological explanation for that. The moon, that's why we always see the same face in the moon, is that as the earth is turning, the moon is turning like this, right? So it's always the dark side of the moon is the same side. We've never seen the other side of the moon, right? Unless someone went up there and took a picture from space, which I think they have done by now. Regardless, metaphorically, allegorically, it still applies, right? We've never seen the dark side of the moon, therefore we've never, that's a metaphor for like the parts of ourselves that we have never seen, that are hidden from us, that are literally in shadow. And so, so Grant said, maybe meditate to the Pink Floyd album, Dark Side of the Moon, and like see what happens. So there I am, and it's like maybe 45 minutes, and I'm like meditating to, and nothing huge is happening or whatever. Um, but then afterwards, I came across a blog of a woman who had this sort of fragmentation in parts, and I was able to see the sort of patterns and everything, reading all the way back and seeing all the entries and the ways that these patterns sort of formed and shaped. And I realized I was like, oh, this is something I saw that in myself. I saw also she was similar enough to me that I could see where some of my own parts and patterns had formed. And looking back at that part of me that had been conditioned by the hypnosis and set up for it by the trauma, that was conditioned to be submissive. And I could see her almost as a separate part in my own mind. The only difference was that my consciousness had sort of basically said, I'm going to leave all of these neural pathways behind because they're not serving me. I'm going to light up these parts of the highway now, and it took me about 2 years to kind of get fully adjusted, to all that and to rebirth myself. But I was able to look back and see where that part of me um, had existed in the mind. And all from meditating on Dark Side of the Moon. And that set me up basically with the foundational knowledge that I needed to sort of understand all of this next information that would come to me after, um, the following throughout the following 3 years. So let's talk about plurality. Again, we can have traumagenic plurality, which we've talked about, but we can also have something called endogenic plurality, which means that the parts they don't form with trauma. And my belief or my understanding is that these can arise, as we talked about, through this sort of neural conditioning where it grows here outward. But my belief is also that it's possible for free-floating consciousness, right? Some types of free-floating consciousness to enter the body, especially at a moment of intense trauma that would be a shock to the system, because the body has a certain openness in that moment, especially if it has already been traumatized. And possibly to come in and take a place in that person's system of parts. Again, this is something that I am still marinating, but the question, and again, the questions are the important part, right? The question for me was, why are some parts quite clearly all the same root stuff in a person? For example, I know one person that has 5 parts in their system, but they are all decidedly from the same root because they all share a couple of very base characteristics and talents. In those permutations, they are very, very different, right? One reacted this way, one reacted this way, but you can see the common denominators among them and be like, okay, this is all the same, the root consciousness essentially. And then there are other folks who are plural who have parts that seem to have no common denominator with either the host or like other existing parts in the system. There is an interview of a woman with DID who and it's Anthony Padilla is the interviewer. So if you're interested in looking it up, it's, just Anthony Padilla, DID. He interviews some folks with DID. And there is one woman who part switches a few times in the interview, and it's fascinating to watch. And you can see that one of the parts appears to be a child alter that appears to be a younger version of herself. From what I can tell in this interview, right? I don't know her, and maybe I'm wrong. I'm just trying to map out what my thoughts are. Um, this child part appears to be a younger version of herself, but then there is another part in the interview that steps in that is a man. And she describes this part as having appeared during a moment of what was very intense trauma for her. And she said, all of a sudden in the middle, I just heard a man's voice telling me, just lie down. You're going to get through this. It's going to be okay. And who had remained a part of her system since that moment, who still acts as a protector, right? And to hear them speak, she has this very like kind of almost like posh London, like almost like Spice Girls kind of accent, right? But the male protector part has like a sort of very gritty Leeds, Doncaster, northern England kind of accent, right? And um, and my theory around this is it possible for a piece of free floating consciousness to enter into the body of a person, especially at a moment of intense trauma or shock when they are um, spiritually and emotionally vulnerable, right? And in need in this case. He stepped in and he was there to help her, right? Um, I think that that's a possibility. And I'll tell you another reason I think that that's a possibility is because it is also a possibility for the consciousness of a person who has recently died to enter the body of a person who is still living, especially if that person already has fragmentation from trauma, has something like DID, or for whatever reason is just more spiritually open. Um, there's a Nigerian phrase that I learned also from Katie Keach, who learned about it from the debut novel of a Nigerian author named Akwekwe Emizi. I hope I pronounced that correctly because I've only read it. The novel is called Freshwater, and she talks about the phrases like having one foot on the other side, right? Or like having a door open. So there is, and that is something that is in her culture's spiritual traditions, right? That there is this idea that some people are born with perhaps that open door or that foot on the other side, or it happens to them through um, through experiences that are shocking, right, to a spiritual system. And I'll talk more about that as well. um, and so for people who have that door open, whether they were born that way or whether they acquired it through trauma, I have now seen or heard about at least two different experiences of people who have been there either at the moment of death or shortly after, who in themselves, maybe had DID or plurality already, who absorbed also the consciousness of the person that passed away. One person found a body, and their face took on, they looked like almost like an AI software blend of their face and the face of the person who died for, a short time after this. Um, there was also an account that I read from a woman who also has DID, and she was talking about how one of her main traumas that really derailed her life, even after DID, was a man who threw himself onto her car as she was driving on the highway, and whose brain just splattered on her windshield at the moment of impact. And without knowing how she knew his name, and she knew that his mother had recently passed, and she knew that um, he was like living with a sister or whatever. And she was like, I don't understand how I know this. This makes no sense. He died at the moment of impact. I could never have found out this about him. But sure enough, when the police report came out, everything that she read about him was accurate to her understanding. And she found herself for a while after that feeling like she had impulses to throw herself in front of cars, which apparently had been, the police also said that this man had had several other incidents where he had attempted to throw himself in front of a car before. And I guess he, had not died until he met this one particular woman. And she also noticed herself having thoughts and feelings that she did not recognize as her own. This can also happen, you guys, this can also happen in people who have heart transplants. There is actually, and I think it literally maybe came onto Netflix just yesterday, and I have not watched it yet. I'm sure I will at some point. It's called The Heart Knows, and it's a story of a man who has a heart transplant, and ends up connecting with the widow of the donor. And I can only assume it's going to be like some romance happens between them. I don't know. I haven't watched the show yet, but something has been documented basically that can happen to folks who receive a heart transplant, or sometimes I think other organs as well, that they can start to take on the thoughts and feelings or even dietary preferences of the folks who were the donors, right? That they had in their own lives. Our hearts actually have neurons in them, right? The neurons we're talking about, all these pathways in the brain, our hearts have some of them too, actually. Katie Keach also just told me, just within the past couple days, as I was telling her I was preparing to make this video, hearts also, our uterus also apparently has like some neurotransmitters in it, which kind of makes sense, right? Um, so, so consciousness can, at least fragments of it, right? Can, and again, we should not think of this as a binary. We should not think of this entire person's spirit coming in and, you know, um, and sort of hijacking a body in its entirety. That may also be possible. But again, with a heart transplant, it may just be a few thoughts and feelings or dietary preferences or something like that, right? It may be some of those patterns, those beliefs, those preferences, reactions, responses that we think of as being those neural pathways, those internal algorithms that essentially amount to like fragments of consciousness, right? And the greater the fragment, the more sophisticated the fragment, then maybe, right? It's an introject or it's a part, right? It's an entire personality, right? Again, these are gradients, these are spectrums. So, so when we're looking at plurality, I think we have a few different possibilities. We have the idea that a person can be born with a singlet consciousness and then undergo traumatic experiences that cause that consciousness to branch out. And yet that consciousness in some permutations will still all be quite obviously traceable to that root consciousness. I know one person like this who they have a really deep passion for the thing that they do, and all five parts have that passion, right? You can see it, it's recognizable, but there are these different versions. And in like the mental health industrial complex clinician way of talking about this, they all actually call this OSDD1A. Like give it a freaking barcode while you're at it, right? But it stands for other specified dissociative disorder. It's kind of like OSDD is when they think of like maybe the parts aren't that far apart. If like a normative singlet consciousness is over here, but they kind of can have the different IFS parts or whatever. And then DID is like all the way over here. They are separate from one another. They are in greater relief to one another. They dissociated from one another. They are maybe even at war with one another. OSDD kind of lives in that liminal no man's land. Again, there are no binaries, there are only spectrums and gradients, right? OSDD is like, OSDD 1A says like the parts all, there are distinctive parts, but they are perhaps still at the root the same person. They are just maybe that person at different ages or in different stages of life or with different conditioning. OSDD1B means that there are parts with different distinctive personalities that are different from one another, but there is no dissociative amnesia between them. They have an okay time communicating or whatever. Maybe that is what it looks like when everyone in your system is getting along, but some of them are from the outside. Some of them have come in through that open door and were not part of the root consciousness that was born in the body. I don't know. Again, these are all just the thoughts. This is the map that I am painting. Um, and again, that plurality, if it is traumagenic, can emerge out of organic trauma, or it can be done on purpose by an adult who usually has bad intentions. And quite often it's done on children because their consciousness is still forming, right? Like the earlier you get at the root, the more power you have to shape it essentially as it grows, right? Um, yeah, pretty dark to think about, but it happens. And so these are different permutations of plurality that we can look at. We can have plurality that emerges, that grows out of us, of what maybe perhaps would have otherwise been a singlet consciousness. And we can have a plurality that is perhaps other parts entering into that system that maybe were a free floating consciousness before, right? I wonder, like, what was that male protector part doing in, before before coming into that woman's system? Or did he arise from within her, right? Or was he a part of the free floating consciousness in the ether that suddenly saw someone in distress and said, I'm going to go in and help? I don't know. I don't know. All I know is that this makes sense, more sense to me um, than most of the available models that we have. Another interesting thing when we think about plurality that grows from the inside out is we can also think of this in terms of that cortical overgrowth, right? That simply allows us a lot of possibilities. And here's where I like to link it to ADHD. And again, this is something that I am throwing around, but this would be different from DID, since there would generally probably be no trauma that created these parts. But my teacher, Grant, has been discussing the idea of plurality more publicly lately. They discussed this in their book talk for Luda, for LA Live. You can find that on YouTube. It's a really amazing talk, and they discuss this idea. They were sort of labeled non-binary in the media, and they kind of came forward and were like, um, you know, whatever you say I am, I'm not, right? Like Grant's like, it's not non anything. It's huge. It's enormous. And it's, it's all encompassing. And so they basically said that they relate to these they, them pronouns, not so much out of a feeling of transness or a feeling of a non-binary, again, not non anything, but out of a feeling of plurality, that it's always been within them a justice league, right? A sort of like a team, and that there are all these sort of personalities, right? That exist within them. And then when they write their comics, their graphic novels, it's like they're all me, like they're all some part of me. And what they said in this talk was that this sort of arose out of a feeling of possibility that they could kind of be anything, especially growing up. And I think I was, similarly privileged in this regard, that Grant and I, growing up, had um, uh, we're born into these bodies that we could sort of dress up in all these different ways that we chose, right? So Grant says, like, you could be Kate Moss one day, you could be a businessman the next day, and you could, do all these kind of interesting, just grow these parts from the inside out, right? By the kind of energy or attention that you give them. And um I don't know that Grant is ADHD or not. We haven't spoken about that. But for me, with my own ADHD, that also feels true. And I also will relate this to uh, someone I know named Brian Hastert wrote an essay a few years ago on the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once and The Will to Live. That's the name of it. You can look it up if you want. And basically, it was about how this film, Everything Everywhere All at Once, for him really encapsulated what it was like for him living with ADHD, to have all of these possibilities that you are considering at all times. Again, that like 60 browser tabs open in the brain, which is also why I think that even though it's autism that has been linked to cortical overgrowth, there is a lot of overlap between ADHD and autism. And my theory is that ADHD and that sort of connecting and synthesizing and your brain being everywhere all at once also probably has to do with an overabundance of neural pathways. Someone wants to correct me on that, go ahead, but that's the framework that I'm working with right now. So it may also be possible to grow these parts through the sort of understanding of these infinite possibilities and giving them enough energy and attention that they begin to become real, right? And if that's if that sounds fantastical, I will point you to a study that was done where undercover agents showed if they spent sufficiently long in the field, they showed the same symptoms and signs of part switching as folks with DID. There is an academic paper written on this. And it's really funny, I think, because I think of Dollhouse, right? Some of you guys know that I spent 3 years on and off dating Joss Whedon in the wake of his divorce. And one of the things we really bonded over was his show Dollhouse, right? Where there are these people whose brains are wiped and then they're programmed with these different personalities that I like related to in a bizarre way, which I didn't even fully understand at the time and the way that I do now. It's pretty odd to think about going from dating the creator of Dollhouse to then creating the Repatterning Project. um, but if you guys watch season 2 of Dollhouse, there is a moment in which Echo, the main doll played by Eliza Dushku, is on a mission. She's been programmed with a personality that she needs to do the job that she's got. And in the middle of the mission, she says the wrong name. She says the name of another one of her parts that she's been programmed as to be to a different client, right? And it's like, it goes on like the breakdown of dissociative amnesia between parts. Like, what an incredible metaphor, right? So there are actually undercover agents who, if they spend enough time acting as the part that they have been, assigned to play in their undercover agent mission, they exhibit the exact same part switching tendencies as people with DID. These parts can be trained and implanted in ourselves and grown out of our own consciousness, right? And so whether it's trauma that creates these distinctive parts, whether they grow apart from each other because those patterns and parts begin to accelerate and become more distinct, whether there is a trauma that is such a shock to the system that it creates a new part almost immediately, whether there is a trauma that is such a shock to the system that it leaves the system open and vulnerable and another piece of consciousness comes in. And that also has been that last possibility that has also been explored by a talk at last year's Plural Positivity World Conference about, a woman who she was from a Middle Eastern culture, although I believe she was raised in England, but she went to travel to, the country of her lineage, and she'd already had DID. So again, she already had that a foot on the other side, an open door, whatever you want to call that. And she goes to this country and she experiences a jinn possession, right? DJINN, like jinn as in like, genie, but that it's a jinn, right? To use the word that comes from the culture itself, it's a jinn. And she describes her experience and like, how do you know what's the jinn and what's a part, right? What is a part of my DID system versus what is this jinn? And how do I manage to, to integrate her into my system so that we can all get along peacefully? It's a really fascinating talk. I'm kicking myself for not looking up her name before I started this video. But if you look on my YouTube profile, I have a playlist called Dissociation Plurality, and I just pinned that video there the other day, so you'll find it. It's something about like system and spirit work, right? And these are the conversations I want to be having, you know? This is where I think things get really, really interesting. What is the difference functionally between an entity possession and another part that is a part of your system, but which maybe is like a persecutor part who's maybe wreaking havoc internally for you or something like that? What is, and can some parts, which I've also heard other folks make an account of, um, there was an account that I read from a ritual abuse survivor, someone who, you know, had parts that were created on purpose by folks that used occult tactics to create abuse, right? And there was one sort of loyal insider, you know, like someone a part that was still loyal to the abusers, and they did a lot of work in therapy. And when that part finally began to understand, like, oh, I'm not needed here anymore, or like the things that I'm doing are actually not helpful in the way that I thought that they were, that part apparently disappeared. Now, did it just go to sleep and stop talking? Is it still there? Or did it leave? Did it leave the body? I don't know. The person in question, the system in question doesn't know either, right? Um, they related that their therapist believes that that part may come back one day, and they aren't so sure, and they're not so sure how they feel about that. Is it better to be without that part or not? All of these are the questions I'm interested in discussing. Let's see. I think I've covered most of what I wanted to cover around that. And now we're going to get into something called witch blood. Witch blood is a controversial topic, because it is essentially the idea that the spirit or consciousness of a person that they are born with, or perhaps that they can acquire, because again, no binaries, right? Or they can grow out of themselves or train from themselves, has special sort of magical abilities and is perhaps not actually fully human. I told you I was going to lose followers over this one, right? Um, there have been other folks who have spoken about witch blood. BJ Swain has recently put out a panel of folks who identify as witch blooded. I also had a witch blood awakening myself a little bit less than 2 years ago. And again, I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. And when I have, you know, talked about it somewhat, I've definitely been met with people being like, but you teach a course in mental health. How can you delude yourself like this? And my answer to that is like, if I am embarking on this path where I am shown things and I'm given information and it clicks so well that to deny it would be to basically shut off everything that has led me down the path that has allowed me to create this amount of success for myself in my life, in my mental health, and in my quality of living that I can't do that. So if you want to say whatever you want to say about me and that like I'm dangerous and should not work as a mental health practitioner because I'm delusional, I don't know, man. I just can't. I would rather put this framework out there because this is the thing that makes sense, right? Basically, what happened is that it was suggested to me by a Serbian folk witch who is like not even on the internet, who a friend of mine trained with, that I might be the specific phenotype of witch blood. And so we went through it, and it turned out that all of the characteristics. And she saw a photo of me, this witch in Serbia, and was basically like, she might be this thing, but I don't know. Like, don't get her hopes up. It's probably not, whatever, right? But then my friend who studied with her basically went through, these are all the characteristics of this type, and down to like, they have to have XYZ and these very specific experiences. And I was just like, well, tick, 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 tick to all the boxes, right? And I wasn't like, I didn't seek that out. I'm not trying to be like, oh, I'm special or, you know, whatever. I don't think I need that to be special. I'm already weird enough, quite frankly. But there you have it, right? So some folks can be born with a spirit or consciousness, and how integrated that part is into them tends to, in my understanding, kind of depend on how stable that part is. Mine is pretty stable. So I don't experience this part of myself as a separate consciousness. The more work that I do in magic and the more work that I do around my witch blood, the more I notice her, the more I notice the feelings and thoughts, et cetera, and the abilities that perhaps come from her. Um, but I still have experienced myself my whole life as a singlet, right? That is not necessarily true of all types of witch blood, because there can be certain types of witch blood where there is a consciousness that is separate, which is also which is referred to generally as like a fetch. A fetch can also just be anyone's sort of etheric double, like the part of yourself that you send out when you astral project. But in witch blood, it's generally thought of as like the part of your consciousness that contains this sort of magic, and it can have many different phenotypes. Not all of them are humans. Some of them are either animal or at least animalistic. Some of them are, have needs and energetically that don't really jive with our like polite social mores of human society. And that's not an excuse for a person with witch blood to like, commit crimes or things like that, or but they need to figure out how to manage that and how to get those needs met in a way that hopefully is safe and consensual, or at least like mitigating harm as much as possible. And I've met a few folks with both types of witch blood, the more stable and the less stable. And um, and as this becomes something that is something I am dealing with in my practice, that I'm definitely not like putting out on my website or anything like that, but the stuff starts to happen, and it starts to come up, and all right, I'll refer you to someone if you think it might be this. I have a friend, Alexander Moore of Practical Occult, who, and even he doesn't advertise that he offers witch blood divinations, because he's like, Arden, 9 times out of 10, the person isn't the thing. So I don't want to lure people in with hope and like, and then be like, sorry, I don't want to be seen like I'm, monetizing people's hopes around this or whatever. So he only does them by referrals. But if you watch this video and you really think that you might be witch blooded, you can go and you can pay him $300, and it takes him 3 days to do the divination, because he wants to make sure it's really, it's important. You don't want to get wrong information about that. So he does it 3 times. That's why it's a little more expensive, but you can go to him, Alexander Moore of Practical Occult, tell him that I sent you via this video. He is where I've learned a lot of what I understand about witch blood. So it is usually an inborn part, and the way that it is able to either integrate and appear as a singlet consciousness or not depends on how stable that part is, and whether it has needs that are going to be at odds with like being a functional human in society, right? Um, it is also possible for a person to acquire a fetch, a form of witch blood, later in life that they're not born with. However, it is rarer. This is also something that I confirmed with Alex recently. It is possible that there may be a moment of trauma, or something such as like an entity possession, or something that is happening to spiritually disrupt the system. And just as another part can come into the system in a vulnerable moment in time like that, sometimes a part that happens to be overtly magical, a fetch, a witch-blooded part, can come into. That is rarer and is apparently more difficult to integrate, but it can also happen. There are ways to acquire witch blood. Now, the way that it is, called blood makes it seem like it has to be something that is born, that is in your lineage, and it can be. But there are also initiations that will essentially give you the same, if not like an actual fetch, will, in my understanding, perhaps shape your consciousness or awaken it in such a way that basically turns you into that thing. So if you're out there going like, oh, but I really want, I really hope I'm the thing. I want to feel like I was, I'm special or something along those lines. First of all, as Alex says, like, it's all about what you do with it. Like there are people who are born with witch blood, but it can also come with like really difficult disabilities, not always, but it can come with certain forms of neurodivergence. Again, not always, right? It can come with really extreme emotions. It can come with these sort of like needs or feelings that are really difficult to handle or integrate. So it is a mixed blessing. But if there's people out there, so it doesn't necessarily like sometimes there are people with witch blood, and if they're not like training or aiming their magic properly, it's not actually going to improve their quality of life. It's actually maybe just going to make things more difficult for them, make them feel even more like an outsider or whatever. And for people who are not witch-blooded, you can seek out an initiation. You can train in magic. If you train in magic hard enough and you keep casting, there may be a point in time where you cannot avoid your evolution into that thing in some capacity, right? So again, it's not a binary. Again, it's something that can evolve, can be created, can be given. I don't know exactly how that happens. I'm just putting the map out there. And I will say also, just while I'm on the topic of witch blood, like obviously it's a controversial topic. I've seen it, create a lot of controversy in the occult scene. And because, especially I think because they're using the term blood, right? Blood purity, right? There's this idea of eugenics. And of course, like we are dealing with like very real threats of eugenics in the United States right now. Whether they are racially motivated or I mean, I'm autistic and there's like I'll be part of a registry apparently. So like there's all of that going on. But it doesn't make it untrue that there are individuals out there who carry all of these characteristics and these abilities that fit these phenotypes. And I also would just call into question, like, given that there is so much overlap between witch blood and disability and neurodivergence, like, is it really just that the normies are worried that if witch blood was such a thing and if it was real, would we treat them, right? And there was a special strain or race or whatever, right? Would we treat them the way that the dominant cultures have historically treated us with eugenics, right? Food for thought. It's a funny argument to be making against a largely disabled population, largely, not exclusively, but largely disabled and or neurodivergent. So that's witch blood, right? So we have singlet consciousness. We have plural consciousness, which can arise from trauma or not from trauma, which can grow out of singlet consciousness and those parts being sort of shaped and that fragmentation happening and those parts growing, accelerating in those patterns and beliefs, et cetera. Those can be created in those moments of trauma, or they can perhaps, even be acquired from possibly free floating fragments of consciousness that might enter into the body, into the system in a moment of vulnerability, right? And then, of course, we have entities, we have gods, we have invocation, we have, a ghost that can leave the spirit of a dead body and temporarily make a home for itself in the consciousness of another person, right? In the body of another person who all of a sudden has these thoughts and feelings that they don't recognize, right? The same with a heart transplant. And then we can also look at certain forms of consciousness that are maybe non-human or superhuman and have these sort of magical abilities and specific traumas that come with them. And then, of course, like we have to also consider that there are things that we think of as disorders that are purely neurological in nature, that have nothing to do with spirit and consciousness inhabiting the body, which have to do instead with the brain architecture, right? So you may have a spirit that is trying to anchor itself into a brain, but maybe that body genetically, right, has Down syndrome, right, which is something that is carried by a chromosome, but then affects the development of the brain. Tourette's syndrome, also, that is a neurological disorder, right? There are certain that's why something like deep brain stimulation can sometimes work to minimize tics, et cetera, right? Because they can actually do something physically to the brain, right? That is the physical consciousness. And uh, and I like thinking of this. This is mentioned in Stanislav Grof's The Way of the Psychonaut. And what he says is when we're thinking about consciousness in the brain, there's a lot of school of thought out there in like old school psychology that consciousness is generated by the brain. And what Stanislav Grof says is consciousness is no more generated by the brain than your TV program is generated by your TV, right? Your TV has to work in order for the program to show on the screen, but the program is not generated in the TV. So when we think of neurological disorders, I often think of someone like with a TV set that unfortunately doesn't have the architecture to sustain the consciousness because there is something in the development of that, whether it's genetically or what have you, that affects the architecture of the brain to support the consciousness. So we kind of have to add that to the map too, because even if we're not talking about consciousness, schizophrenia is that, right? This is why DID so often gets mistaken for schizophrenia, because in my belief anyway, it is easier for a mental health professional to imagine, oh, their brain is causing these hallucinations, these visual and or auditory hallucinations. That's why, like, it's schizophrenia. This is happening within the brain. The brain is just having like a short circuit or whatever, and it's doing some stuff. Whereas DID is like, oh, I'm hearing voices, but no, I'm hearing the other consciousness that is actually in my head because it is anchored to my body, right? So I think it's important that we acknowledge the difference between something that is a neurological disorder versus something that is an expression of consciousness, if we're going to paint this map fully. And I think, oh, and of course, like there's also, we can classify under neural architecture. We can also talk about chemical deficiencies. We can talk about TBI, traumatic brain injury. So that's like an acquired, literally acquired through not trauma as in like a traumatic event, but like trauma, like head trauma, right? That can change the way the brain is able to function, right? That's why a lot of football players end up because they get knocked in the head a lot, right? There was that football player who like donated his brain to science because his depression was like so bad that he committed suicide and but was like, I'm not going to shoot myself in the head because I want to donate my brain because you guys need to figure out what's going on. Like that's it's sad, but that was thoughtful of him at least to do for his fellow players who he did not want to suffer more. So that can also be injury to the brain can also affect that. But also we can be born with chemical deficiencies, right? I have ADHD. I do think it is related to cortical overgrowth in some sense, but it is also very much related to dopamine deficiency. My brain just does not make enough dopamine to keep me motivated and stimulated. And so I will get easily addicted to things that do give me dopamine, such as like having a crush on someone or whatever. Nowadays, I self-medicate by making music and solving puzzles like this one, right? This is why, despite the fears I have around talking about all of these kind of controversial subjects, I kind of feel a need to because I'm driven by my dopamine to solve things. And so I'm not putting it back in the closet, I'll tell you that much. So in conclusion, we have many different ways that a consciousness or multiple consciousnesses can exist in a human body. We have singlet consciousness, which can be patterned and repatterned. We have plural consciousness, which can either grow out of singlet consciousness. We can be born with a part. We can be born with a plural consciousness, and the way that that part either integrates or doesn't integrate will depend a lot on the context of our upbringing and the needs of that particular part. We can have parts that enter into a system, especially when we are especially vulnerable, whether those are the consciousness of a person who has recently passed, or another free-floating consciousness that makes a home for itself within our system, because maybe we need it in that moment in time, or whether it is an entity possession that can possess either a plural person or a singlet person, right? Uh, and those other forms of consciousness can stay and like take up root there, or they can come and go, right? A skilled occultist doing invocation can call another consciousness into themselves in a controlled manner and then know how to release that consciousness when it's done. Usually it's going to be, you know, a friendly consciousness. It's like the difference between inviting someone into your house versus like having a break-in, right? It's going to be a very, even though it's both things are still a person in your house, they're a very different experience, right? Between a demonic entity possession. By demonic, I just mean something that has bad intentions. That's the way I'm using that word in this context anyway, versus a consensual invocation to perform a ritual or something like that. And our singlet consciousness can learn all of these patterns that form up our personalities through our experiential interactions with the world and what we learn and how our neurodevelopment, how our neural pathways form. Interestingly enough, for plural people, their parts may possibly only really get the opportunity to take on patterning and conditioning when they are in the body because we experience the world through our five senses, right? Although I do think that there are some parts in plural people who can observe from the outside, even if they can't take control of the body, they can observe from inside, and they may also learn things through this experience as well. Again, these are binaries and these are the questions, right? These are the fruitful questions that I think we should be asking. And so then there's, you know, the neurology of the brain. There's consciousness, there's the body, which includes the brain, and there are all these different permutations of consciousness that can sometimes be ours, that can be shaped either by ourselves or by other people. And then there are also consciousnesses that exist outside us that perhaps can enter us. And I think this is the map that we should start with when we're talking about mental health, particularly with mental health cases that cannot be easily solved. And again, I think honestly, I think almost 90% of mental health issues can be solved just by looking at patterning and repatterning. But for the ones that can't, for the ones that defy explanation, for the ones that the so-called mental health professionals deem as too difficult or outside their wheelhouse, this is the conversation I would like to be having. And one of the reasons I wanted to make this video in particular is that right now, the big conversation in the DID world, in the clinical DID world, is a sort of war between the mental health, quote unquote, experts who are usually singlets and the folks with lived experience of DID, some of whom are clinicians also, who got into the field perhaps to better understand themselves and now are trying to advocate for greater change and progress in the way that DID is treated. And over here we have, you know, these folks over at Harvard McLean Hospital, which is their, you know, where they treat DID or whatever, or where they claim to treat DID. We have Dr. Matthew Robinson basically standing up and giving a presentation. And what he thinks is important to talk about right now is like the fact that he thinks there's YouTubers and TikTokers out there who claim to have DID but are faking it. And so he makes this big talk about like, I think these people are faking what they're doing. And then they double down and he releases, even in the wake of a lot of criticism and a change.org petition to have Dr. Robinson's license revoked. They double down and they put out a paper on it, right? An academic paper. This is why we think they're faking. Because honestly, like, the more I do this, the less I believe in things like credentials and academia because I see all the falsehoods in this system. And so, like, while there's someone out there who's basically saying, I don't think you have DID, because people with DID act like they're ashamed of it. So if you're on there putting it on YouTube, you're just doing it for attention, right? This is so fucking Fisher Price, you guys. Like, this is the conversation that our experts are having. I'm gonna look at you and say, I think you're faking it. I'm not even gonna enter into your experience and say, like, why do you think this way? What is going on for you? What is present here, right? I'm really tired and angry about the primitive, obsolete nature of the conversations happening in the mental health industry. And I am really tired of um, professionals in the mental health industry getting angry at me for calling it out because they want to keep telling themselves that they're doing enough within the system as it is for people. And maybe they have some people that they do help. Cool. Good for you. But there are people that I am helping right now who were failed by the mental health industry in almost all aspects. And so I'm going to go on a limb and I'm going to say that what they are doing is not enough. And this is the conversation I want to start having. And I don't care if it makes me look crazy, because in these kinds of cases, which I have been dealing with more in the past 3 years, these are the answers that have presented themselves to me and that have shown a light down the path. Treating something like DID is going to be very different if you understand the types of consciousness that can inhabit a body and the desires, beliefs, and motivations of each of those consciousnesses, and getting them to play together as a team. There is so much potential in something like using spirit diplomacy, for example. The tactics that an occultist might use to have a conversation with a disembodied spirit, that a psychic medium perhaps might use to look at treating certain mental health issues when what you are dealing with is a piece of consciousness that is manifesting itself within a body. This is the map that I want to talk about. All right. Thanks for listening. Yeah. I hope I get to have these conversations more often than I need to keep having conversations about personality disorders and things of that nature. Thanks, guys.